Thank you very much for the enthusiastic welcome. And I'd like to thank you for the wonderful introduction. As I sat there, I was thinking, I don't have to get up and speak because the ideas have already been so fluently expressed. But I would like to thank the Nikos Poulantas Institute for having invited me to deliver the 11th memorial lecture. Poulantas' work helped to shape a very important moment in the development of Marxist theory. And I feel very honored to have been invited to speak to you this evening. I'm also very happy to have been provided the opportunity of visiting Athens for the second time in my life. The first was 50 years ago, shortly before the 1967 coup, at a time when I was a graduate student, as you heard, in Frankfurt. My journey this time, 50 years later, entailed a rather prolonged stopover in Frankfurt because of a snowstorm that closed the airport. And so I spent some time recollecting that journey that I took with a friend, hitchhiking from Frankfurt to Athens. Yeah, that was possible then. In preparing for this trip, I realized that there is an obligation that I have never properly fulfilled to people here in Greece. When I was in jail, and you heard the history of my arrest, when I was in jail from 1970 to 1972, facing, as you heard, the death penalty during the first period of my incarceration, enormous numbers of people here in Greece joined the international campaign to save my life. And I was aware of the demonstrations and the organizing that took place here. And as a matter of fact, I will never forget the message of solidarity I received from Greek political prisoners. This message, along with a beautiful wood carving, was smuggled out of a Greek prison and brought to me in the US. And that is a memory that I will take with me for the rest of my life. So that I would like to thank you, those of you who are still alive, who participated in my campaign. It's interesting, someone just came up to me and said, "I'm very old. I'm 60 years old." And I said, "Well, if you're very old, I must be very, very old," because I'm almost 15 years older than you are. But I would like to thank all of you and the children of those who joined the campaign, the grandchildren of those who participated in that campaign. And I'd like you to know that I've attempted to contribute to the continuation of this tradition of international solidarity. And perhaps we'll have the opportunity to talk about the importance of generating solidarity for Palestine, particularly at this moment in history. I've chosen to share with you some ideas regarding the importance of the theories and practices associated with what can be called abolition feminism. And let me tell you that personally, I came to feminism through Marxism, both the traditional route of reading Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, and other works, and through involvement in struggles. But I should point out at that time, we saw ourselves as the upholders of working class women's rights, the rights of poor women, black women. We identified with revolutionary women and objected to, and I think you've already heard a version of this, what we called white bourgeois feminism. And I have to say, I, for one, still object to bourgeois feminism. But the trajectory I want to discuss this evening is one that has helped to redefine the term feminism. While it is a trajectory that specifically reflects the history of the American hemisphere and the centrality of colonization and slavery, it is highly relevant to Europe, especially in this contemporary era of massive movement from areas of the world previously dominated by European countries. And by the way, contrary to dominant beliefs, Europe is no longer a white continent. Europe is no longer white. And we are experiencing the long-standing consequences of colonization. In the US, of course, and you've heard reference to the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black Lives. That movement has not only announced to the world that Black lives do matter, but also that Black women can lead that movement, that Black women who are feminist and queer can not only lead, but change the very nature of leadership. And they also tell us that this is a movement which should be embraced by all, because when Black lives finally matter in the world, that will mean that all lives matter. And I was reminded of this afternoon when I had the opportunity to make a very short visit to City Plaza, where almost 400 refugees are housed. I was deeply impressed by the work activists have done there, not only to create livable spaces for people who have been demonized and criminalized, but to create an egalitarian community that is autonomously run by the refugees and activists. I promised the people there that I would take their message back to the US, calling for solidarity, and also to urge people where I live to recognize, to realize that the military interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere staged by the US government bear much of the responsibility for the current situation. I have spent most of my life studying Marxist ideas and have identified with groups that not only embraced Marxist-inspired critiques of the dominant socioeconomic order, but have also struggled to understand the relationship between racism and capitalism, having especially followed the theories of communist and anti-imperialist in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, other parts of the world, and having worked, as you heard, inside the Communist Party of the US for a number of years. I was a member of a club that took the names of Che Guevara and Patrice Lumumba. It was the Che Lumumba Club. From my perspective, Marxism has always been both a method of criticism and an object of criticism. In this context, I have found the term racial capitalism, introduced by Cedric Robinson in his pivotal study entitled Black Marxism. I found that term, racial capitalism, very helpful in theorizing the historical entanglement of racism and capitalism. It is not possible to develop a Marxist feminist approach free of ideological influences of racism if one assumes that gender as an abstract, unraced category can simply be introduced as an antidote to patriarchal assumptions within Marxist theories. Just as the supposition that the category class transcends gender, just as that supposition leads to a hierarchy of male dominance within the concept of class, so also does the positioning of class as the universal under which race is subsumed. So does that assumption enable a white supremacist hierarchy within the category class. Moreover, the social realities of the working class require us to take into account not only the racial composition of the working class, but also the extent to which racism has helped to produce the unquestioned notion that the prototypical worker is white and male. This is unfortunately not the place to pursue this more general discussion, but if we had time, I would discuss the need to take more seriously contemporary interventions regarding the changing character of the working class in the era of global capital, and especially the extent to which care work, which is largely performed by women from the global south, that is to say, reproductive labor, is becoming much more central to the global economy. Just as we recognize that gender is always subject to race and class, there are other determinants, sexuality, ability, nationality that we need to attend to. And let us not forget how vigorously the assumed binary structure of gender itself has been contested. Trans movements have helped us to understand the work that ideology does in dissuading us from contesting that which is presented as normal. Challenging this normalization, the normalization of the binary structure of gender, inspires us to contest other normative notions. For example, the permanency of capitalism. But let us move on toward a discussion of the historical developments underlying the notion of abolition feminism. And I guess I should first clarify, I am in Europe, and I should clarify that this has nothing to do with the abolition of prostitution. And oftentimes, when one places the notion of abolition next to feminism, the assumption is that we are referring to the abolition of prostitution. I just want to make it very clear that I support the right of sex workers to organize. And I am referring to the feminism that embraces the abolition of such repressive apparatuses as the police, as we know this institution, and prisons as the primary mode of punishment in the 21st century. But within the larger historical framework, I'm also referring to the abolition of slavery. And in some way, we can see the institutions of the police and prisons as institutions, to a certain extent, spawned by slavery. In the United States, in particular, we can draw a line that links the current prison system to the failure to address the most pressing problems that characterize the aftermath of slavery. In other words, as W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out in his most important work, Black Reconstruction in America, the abolition of the system of slavery succeeded only in the negative sense. And while the actual institution may have been constitutionally prohibited, the institution's extensive and profound impact on social relations in the U.S. was not seriously addressed. And we can say that we are only now in the 21st century attempting to address some of the repercussions of slavery. Douglas Blackman, historian in the U.S., wrote an interesting book by the name of Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. His argument is that slavery did not really end in 1863 or 1865 with the 13th Amendment, but rather that it did not come to an end until the 1940s. His work is about the convict lease system, which is a particular form of punishment that in many ways reinstated slavery. As some of you know, there is that clause in the U.S. Constitution which provides an exception, and the exception consists of convicted criminals. So constitutionally, one might argue it is still possible to enslave convicted criminals. Ava DuVernay, filmmaker, you may have seen the film she made a number of years ago called Selma, has recently done a documentary called 13th, which is precisely about the ways in which the prison system developed in connection with slavery. But the point that I want to make is that if you accept the argument that the convict lease system was a form of slavery, it was an effort to manage black labor in ways that replicated the institution of slavery, that if we argue that slavery did not end until the 1940s, when that system was finally abolished, that would mean that in the history of the United States of America, we have had 320 years of slavery and only about 70 years without slavery. Whichever way you look at it, the majority of U.S. history has been a history of slavery. The failure to address the repercussions of slavery can be seen as a motivating factor for the outcome of the most recent presidential elections. And I have to say that the candidate who was elected is not my president. But Trump's call to make America great again is really a call to make America, we might say, to make America old and white and male. As you can see from the appointments he made to his cabinet. And since I'm inserting this brief comment on Donald Trump, I might as well share with you the fact that the senatorial candidate from Alabama, who has been endorsed by Trump, this candidate, as you may have heard, is accused of child molestation. But he has also said, and this is the reason I bring him into the conversation, and I'm quoting, "America was great. America was great at the time when families were united." Excuse me. Let me say that again. America was great at the time when families were united, even though we had slavery. Even though we had slavery. Now, I have referred to racial capitalism, the complex connection between slavery and capitalism. The slave trade, of course, was a very important aspect of primitive accumulation. Slavery played a central role in generating wealth for the European shipping industry, banking, insurance, the wool industry, the cotton industry, and certainly the profits from slave trading itself, along with sugar, coffee, cotton, tobacco, etc. So I want us to keep in mind the extent to which racism has been inextricably tied to capitalism, because often there is the assumption that one can speak about capitalism within one context and racism is an external factor. The major surge in the prison population in the US that led to what is now referred to as mass incarceration. This occurred during the 1980s. That is to say, during the era of the globalization of capital. Well, capitalism has always been global, but you are aware of what I'm referring to, right? The rise of neoliberalism, the disestablishment of free or affordable services in countries all over the world. And I understand that here in Greece, it is still possible to attend the university free of charge. Am I right? Some people are saying, well, at least you don't have to come up with $40,000 a year simply in order to study. And I can tell you that if I inform audiences of students in the US that this is the situation here in Greece, they would probably react in awe. So it's not just that education has been commoditized, but it is also the notion that education is a commodity has been completely normalized. And I mentioned the 1980s, this pivotal era. In the US, cities began to deindustrialize, and factories began to migrate to areas of the world where cheap labor could be discovered. Jobs were lost in the US, and especially and disproportionately in Black and Latino communities. And at the same time, housing subsidies were reduced, education became increasingly commoditized, increasingly inaccessible, healthcare became privatized, and generally life became more expensive and out of reach for those who were hurt by deindustrialization. So we're talking about the disappearance of the auto industry, the disappearance of the steel industry. And now, global capitalism reaped benefits from the retooling of racism's grounded in colonization and slavery. These massive economic changes produce surplus populations, surplus communities, people who no longer had the means with which to live. They became the potential recruits for the developing prison industrial complex. Because the last hired are always the first fired. The targeted communities were people of color. This is in part why today there are such disproportionate numbers of Black people and Latinx people in the prison system. Prisons became places to warehouse those who could no longer find a place in a changed capitalist society. Of course, capitalism is very shrewd. The prisons themselves became sources of profit. Not only, as you heard in the introduction, through private prisons, but through all of the contracted services provided through corporate contacts. So this is precisely why we offered the term prison industrial complex to social justice movements and to academics who were attempting to find ways of understanding the role of punishment in shaping social relations. This was a way of acknowledging the connection between global capitalism, racial capitalism, state punishment. And now you are perhaps aware of the fact that the US incarcerates 25% of the entire world's imprisoned population. That is to say, 25% of the people who are in prison on the entire planet are in prisons in the US. But if you look at the situation of women, you discover that 1/3 of all of the women in the world who are in prisons inside the United States. And we should also make the connection between the rise of the prison industrial complex and what is often referred to as the migrant crisis, the so-called refugee crisis. The same forces of global capital underlie both processes. And of course, the rise of the prison industrial complex has led to the extension of carceral strategies to institutions beyond the realm of punishment, specifically schools, healthcare, housing, all of these institutions that were truncated during the initial era of global capitalism, the ones that fell victim to the neoliberal discourse of hyper-individualism. Any institution designed to reflect the public good or to respond to community need was abolished or privatized. Schools began to look like prisons. Police officers were placed in prisons. Metal detectors within schools, and we're talking about schools in poor communities and communities of color. There is an emphasis, a greater emphasis on discipline than on learning. And we've seen, of course, the privatization of schools and the cordoning off and commoditization of healthcare. And at the same time, carceral strategies began to define the major effort to address the needs of immigrants and refugees. And I should point out that if one looks at the private prison industry, headquartered in the US, of course, the most profitable sector of that industry is immigrant detention. And it's very interesting that after Trump was elected, the stocks, which had fallen for the private prison companies such as Corrections Corporation of America and others, they began to soar. For most of my life, I've been doing work on prison issues. I did not imagine my life in that way. But I became involved in the struggle to free political prisoners during the 1960s. And from that period to our current abolitionist campaigns, which call upon people to imagine a future where prisons are no longer needed and where security is not anchored in such violent institutions as the police. So abolition is a call to reimagine justice, to imagine a justice system that does not have to rely on such violent means of addressing a whole range of issues, many of which have very little to do with actual harm. But at the same time, we have to imagine different ways of addressing harm. How do we address harm in ways that are not retributive and do not serve as ways of reproducing the very violence we say we want to get rid of? When we first raised the call for abolition, there were those who argued, there were feminists who argued, that precisely at a time when we had just succeeded in having domestic violence and sexual assault recognized as crimes, that we were calling for an abolition of the system that would make male purveyors of violence against women accountable. But is it not time to think about more effective ways of ridding the world of gender violence and other products of toxic masculinities? And I use the term toxic masculinities from Angela Harris's legal analysis from her article, Heteropatriarchy Kills. And I mean that people gendered as female can also be purveyors of these toxic masculinities. But the question is, how can we envision a world in which violence against women is no longer the most pandemic form of violence on the planet? The title of my lecture has Abolition, Feminism as the main theme. And it is in part a response to carceral feminism. Carceral feminism is a term that emerged in the aftermath of analyses of the anti-violence movement. And I'm specifically referring to Beth Ritchie's book, which is called Arrested Justice: Black Women, Violence, and America's Prison Nation. She points out that a feminism that relies on criminalization will not only not rid the world of gender violence, because these institutions of violence tend to reproduce violence rather than eliminate it. But she points out that this kind of feminism, this carceral feminism, will assist in the buildup of prisons. It will, even if inadvertently, bolster the structural racism that is most dramatically seen in the prisons of the world, which hold a disproportionate number of Black and Latinx people, of indigenous people, people from the global South. And I make this observation, recognizing that this is an era defined by the rise of women. The Women's March in the aftermath of the inauguration of Trump was an amazing experience. Was there a Women's March in Athens? Mm-hmm. Pardon me? Well, I think it's important to recognize that this is a historical conjuncture in which work that has been going on for generations, for decades, and even centuries is now beginning to bear fruit. We can, talk about all of the powerful men who are now toppling. The problem is, if they keep going, how many will be left? I'm not arguing that men are necessarily sexist in that way, because I see that they're very, very important men who have joined the feminists. Well, let me put it this way. Men have joined a very important feminist movement. And as a matter of fact, what is so exciting about the Black Lives Matter movement is that young Black men identify as feminists and see feminism as a methodology of struggle, as opposed to something that is attached to particular kinds of bodies. So when I say that this is an era defined by the rise of women, I'm thinking about Anna Julia Cooper, who specifically was referring to Black women around the end of the 1800s when she made the statement, when and where I enter, when and where I, as a Black woman enter, the entire community enters with me. And so we can say that when women rise up, and particularly when Black women and women of color rise up, that means that the entire world is rising up as well. But women cannot simply aspire to take the places of men, but rather must aspire toward radical transformation. If we simply want to become what white, straight, cis men in power have been in the past, we're simply replicating the structures that will continue to perpetrate the very violence that we are challenging. If we don't challenge the structures, if we don't challenge the very meaning of the hierarchies of power, it might be said that women are fighting for the right to be as violent as men, and that would make no sense at all. This is why campaigns demanding the equality of women in the military should always be combined with a deep critique of the military itself. And this is why support for marriage equality with respect to LGBTQ community should be combined with a radical critique of the institution of marriage, which not only is grounded in capitalist notions of property inheritance, but also structurally harbors the very violence we oppose when we say we stand up against gender violence. I think that our social justice movements can benefit from expanded temporalities, from a sense that we are doing what we need to do right now, not so much because we expect to reap the ultimate fruits of our struggle, but in order to enable others to continue the fight. I am attracted to indigenous temporalities that cannot be contained in one lifetime or even 2 or 3 generations. And this counters the capitalist temporality, which tends to be contained in how much profit one can reap in one lifetime. When we resist, when we call for a better world, our vision finds its focus generations into the future. We struggle now, not only for the world we collectively want and need, but also in order to enable generations to continue our work. And so it is in this context that I think about the struggle against the occupation of Palestine. It has been 50 years since the Six-Day War in 1967. And many of you have no memory of that war because you were not born. But our memories need to be expanded. Historical memories can't be contained in a lifetime. It has been almost 70 years since the Nakba in 1948, but the Palestinian people have not given up. And in this context, the Palestinian people are an inspiration to people in struggle all over the world. Donald Trump's announcement a few days ago that the U.S. will recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel made me want to say even more powerfully than before, Donald Trump is not my president. And let me conclude by saying that this provocation should be met with renewed support of the boycott of Israel. Boycott, divestment, sanctions, freedom, and justice for Palestine. Thank you very much.